Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, a wonderful day to talk about some of the exciting short form literature that exists out there, and I do have a good one for you today, folks. I am going to talk about a short story that is about lighthouses and sea monsters. I am referring to The Foghorn by Ray Bradbury, which was published in 1951 in one of his short story collections. For those who don't know, and I have a feeling that many people might know who Ray Bradbury is, especially if they're clicking on the link to this video, but for those who don't know, Ray Bradbury was an author who lived from the early 1900s to 2012. He was known for science fiction, most famous for Fahrenheit 451, which is one of my favorite books. I've read it before. I think it's pretty good. It's about burning books in a dystopian future. I think Ray Bradbury does a good job on it. He's also known for The Martian Chronicles, which I haven't read, and a whole host of short stories with a science fiction-y type of theme. Ray Bradbury is seen as, at least by me, as one of the big science fiction authors of the 1900s, alongside Harlan Ellison, Isaac Asimov, and Philip K. Dick. All of them helped create a lot of science fiction that we're still talking about to this day. Something interesting is that near the end of his life, Ray Bradbury kind of went back on some of the things he had said in Fahrenheit 451. So rather than saying, oh, this is what Big Brother looks like, or this is a dystopian future and what those in power try to do, Ray Bradbury was like, oh, this is just about, how technology isn't that great, which probably isn't what the real message of those stories was. But that's what he said at the end of his life. So, sometimes people sabotage their own work in the end. But without further ado, let's talk about The Foghorn. I will do a summary, a brief analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Foghorn focuses on the characters of Johnny and McDunn as two lighthouse keepers. Johnny is pretty new, and McDunn has been there for a fair amount of time. It doesn't say specifically, but it's clear that Johnny is new, and McDunn says, okay, so I have to tell you something about what is happening with this lighthouse. And so it's clear that there's something strange going on at the beginning of this story. And McDunn begins talking about the effect that the foghorn has on sea creatures. They turn off the lights and they can see out in the ocean that the sound of the foghorn, the lighthouse, it draws in creatures from the sea, like fish who McDunn say come to sort of worship this stone structure coming out of the ground. So McDunn is noting that this foghorn, this lighthouse, seems to have a very unusual effect on the fish, the life of the sea. And McDunn also talks about how there's sort of like an unknown about the bottom of the sea, that humanity will eventually walk down there, but we don't know what's down there right now, especially with our submarines and whatnot. We're just pretty clueless. And so at this point, McDunn gives a warning about a sea creature that he says approaches the lighthouse every year. And if Johnny wants to leave after the end of this night, he can go ahead and do that. But he wants Johnny to know about the sea creature so that he can make an informed decision about this job. A short while after that, the sea begins to bubble, and out rises a giant sea monster with what they describe as a very long neck, and it seems like the the sea creature just goes on for forever, having taken a long time to get from the bottom of the ocean to where they are now. And McDunn shows Johnny that every time the foghorn goes off, the sea creature cries out. And McDunn's theory or opinion is that the foghorn is sort of has been calling out to the creature, and the creature is all alone in some sort of way, and so it's like a shared feeling of remorse that they're letting each other know that they're not alone out there. However, it's clear that the sea creature, the sea monster, is getting very angry, and it begins yelling at the lighthouse. And McDunn warns them that they have to head down to the cellar. And as they do that, the sea monster destroys the lighthouse and the foghorn before crying out for having done such a thing, and it sinks back into the ocean. The next day, the men are rescued, and Johnny decides that he's going to quit at this point and goes back to his house with his lights, while McDunn repairs the lighthouse and makes sure that it's stronger than before. But they both note that the sea creature doesn't return, as it might have just sank to the depths for a million more years. And as the story ends, the narrator notes that Johnny frequently goes back to the lighthouse just to listen to the foghorn, and hopefully he can hear the sea monster as well. And that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, what an interesting story Ray Bradbury has presented here. The main theme of this story that I think Ray Bradbury wants to get across is that of isolation. This lighthouse work is isolating in and of itself, pretty lonely, and that like the lighthouse is described as being far away from civilization, where another town isn't, not for a couple 100 miles or so. There's an interesting quote that I would like to read to you. It was 7:15 of a cold November evening, the heat on, the light switching its tail in 200 directions, the foghorn bumbling in the high throat of the tower. There wasn't a town for 200 miles down the coast, just a road, which came lonely through the dead country to the sea, with few cars on it, a stretch of 2 miles of cold water out to our rock, and rare few ships. And so there you get the feeling of isolation at the very beginning of the story. Ray Bradbury wants you to know that these people are alone. There's no one coming to help them if anything goes wrong. And it can be a pretty lonely life out there, which Johnny must feel like it's getting to him, because eventually he quits, along with what happens in this story. So I do like how Ray Bradbury gets at that isolation, which he peppers in throughout the story. But not only is the lighthouse isolated and the people are feeling that isolation, but the sea monster in the story is also isolated. It's McDunn notes that the sea monster has been alone for millions of years, and it's rising out of the ocean to greet what it might feel as another sea monster of its kind. And that's why it frequently shows up. This isolation brings sadness and loneliness, and maybe some understanding when you find someone of the same kind. But to be isolated for so long, it might make you not understand, other people. Like it might be hard to relate to anything. So although you're hearing the sounds of another person, like, can you really understand them if you've been isolated for so long? That it might be hard to relate to anyone at that point. So it's interesting how Ray Bradbury gets at that isolation, and that might explain some of why the sea monster destroys the lighthouse tower near the end of the story. But another big theme of this story that I think Ray Bradbury might be hinting at is that of the unknown. So McDunn talks about not really knowing what's in the ocean, of humans won't be able to fully get to the bottom of the sea for thousands upon thousands of years, which isn't necessarily true as we examine the Marianas Trench in like the 70s or the 60s. But maybe we according to Bradbury, we might not have fully explored the sea, as there's just so much of it, and who knows what's down there. McDunn argues that there's fairy kingdoms or something like that. But we don't know what's in the ocean because we can't really go down there, and we can flash lights towards it, but we can't possibly examine everything. There's the mystery of the fish at the beginning of the story. Why are they visiting the lighthouse? McDunn says it's to worship, but we don't really know if that's true. And he also ascribes motive to the sea monster, that it's been lonely for millions of years and it's coming because it hears its own sound coming out. Because as the narrator notes, the sea monster is hearing, or the sea monster emits a sound that is like the foghorn. So it's like two creatures of the same kind coming to greet one another. But there is an issue here. It's the issue is ascribing motive to the unknown is very difficult. Like, we're trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. And I think ultimately what Ray Bradbury might be getting at is that McDunn is wrong here. Like, he talks about the mystery of the fish and that they're coming to worship this, and the sea monster is coming to greet an old friend. But the issue here is that the sea monster ends up destroying the lighthouse. Like, maybe it's because it's been isolated for so long. But what I think it might be is this is an act of aggression. Like, the lighthouse is another one of the sea monsters, and it's coming to attack a sea monster on rival land or something like that. And McDunn is just, trying to find answers in the dark. Ascribing motive or an understanding to something that we can't possibly grapple with because it's too large. It's too much for our minds to really understand. And I like that idea of the story because McDunn might think he knows about it, but ultimately, like, he could have gotten Johnny and him killed by standing in awe of the monster rather than what he should have done, which is run away from this thing that will very clearly try to kill you. So I think it's fascinating. Maybe Bradbury might have not have been trying to get at that, but that's how it ends up sounding, at least from my perspective, that when you try to, put a name to something or try to understand something that you can't, it's really like religion there, where like you're saying like, oh, God did this. Well, how do you know that God meant that when he did this? His intentions might not be good. They might be harmful in the end. In a lot of ways, this story reminds me of Three Skeleton Key, where you have the lighthouse keepers fighting against rats, sort of like an unfamiliar territory and being isolated against an enemy. But it also seems very Lovecraftian in nature. You're thinking of like Cthulhu and all those other creatures who we can't possibly comprehend. And rather than confronting this unknown, Johnny just decides to quit the job and leave at the end because he would much rather be in the comfort of his own light at nights rather than in this dark lighthouse that brings forth creatures from the sea. So he doesn't want to confront the unknown. I think that's a pretty apt comparison, and it's part of the reason why I like this story so much. The only issue that I have with this story is that it does seem like Ray Bradbury doesn't trust us to understand the message, as he keeps repeating his message about isolation. Like, I got it the first time, Ray Bradbury. You don't have to treat me like a child. I know what you're getting at, and I'm sure anybody else who reads this can understand your message about isolation. And so, that's the only issue with the story. But maybe it doesn't hurt the story so much. It's just, letting him know that we get it already. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Foghorn by Ray Bradbury. A pretty fascinating and fun story, I would say, that is going to probably leave me with a lot to think about as I go forward with more short stories. I am glad that I read this one by Ray Bradbury, as I haven't read any of his other short stories before. I do think this is probably going to be one of the better short stories that I read this year. Just making a guess right there, it might show up on my year-end list, so who knows about that. But I do recommend this. So this is a big recommend. If you read any short story that I talk about this year, make it this one. I don't think you can go wrong with it. Although you know what's going to happen because I just told you, I do think that there's a lot to say about the build-up and the awe. Like it's awesome in a traditional sense in that it's inspiring me with a sense of awe. So definitely go check it out. If you read it before, comment below. I would love to hear from you. Let's have a discussion about the Foghorn. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about the Foghorn and Ray Bradbury if they don't already know about him. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and sea monstery travels. Farewell.